Okay.
Hi, this is Paul. Those of you watching on the Vanderclip station, the TLC back catalog might recognize this guy. He was just a young fella then, He didn't have his job or his status or all those things, and now he's all grown up and he's an economist and he's still talking about the same kind of stuff he was talking about back then, Marcus. So, welcome.
Thanks. Yeah, well, if you watch the video that when I had you and Dan Klein and Eric Mattson on, you kept saying throughout that video, hey, I'm not an economist, so I don't know the same things you guys talk about, but we are far from normal economists. So obviously the kind of topics we talked about that no one would expect to hear that anywhere near an economics department. So it's
Really?
not far afield, yeah.
Oh, interesting. Well, I figure most economists are just talking about the economy and money and those kinds of things. So,
Yeah, but
um,
it turns out that the economy is just one bracketed thing that we decided is its own category in modernity, which was a wrong decision to make in the first place. So all of
yeah,
these things are coming collapsing into each other now.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. Well, why don't you give us a little introduction about yourself? Tell us your YouTube channels because you're still putting out content and you're teaching now. And so just give us a little update.
yeah, so I guess right now, I'm an assistant professor of economics at Eastern University outside of Philadelphia, where I grew up. And when I talked to you about 4 or 5 years ago, I had been working on a small website and some YouTube videos at the time under the name The Econ Playground. I'm still under that name, but I transitioned it to Substack and YouTube instead of a bad WordPress site and YouTube. So that's basically where I'm at now. If people want to find me, I don't. It's not my main job, obviously, but that's where I dump extra thoughts that I don't have any space to put in any of my actual paid work.
So how are you
So.
finding teaching?
Um, it is, in one sense, it's what I always wanted to do, but there's many difficulties that come along with it, right? That you don't always expect at the beginning. But
Such
I'm
as
definitely getting the hang of it. Yeah,
such
such
as
as
students.
such as having to deal with students. Yeah, but but also just like the spending so much time in grad school, almost assuming that the people that you're talking about know a certain level of idea. Once you need to get back down and explain the basics, I realize I don't really understand the basics, right? Because once you're inside a framework with someone else, you can assume certain parts of that framework. And then if you want to be a little bit adventurous, you break open some of the hood and try to figure out what's going on underneath. But you quickly back away when you realize you might take the car apart and then you don't have a car to work on anymore, right? So, but when you're with the students, you actually have to explain to them the parts, and it's much more difficult than you realize. But I'm learning probably more than they are.
I think that's true. And that's true of just about any kind of teaching. In church work, often if you want someone to learn, make them a Sunday school teacher because then suddenly
Hmm.
they realize they're in front of these people and they don't want to talk about motivation. They don't want to look dumb or stupid or bad or anything like that. So they study 5 times more than the students study so that
Hmm.
they actually have a degree of competence because then students are going to ask questions and it's like, well, I want to be able to answer that question. I want to do it truthfully. I want to do it in a helpful way and on and on
Hmm.
and on.
And I'm finding that it clarifies my thinking a lot as well, because
Yep.
the people, let's say, that I would interact with at conferences who were also early career academics teaching somewhere, and the way that they talk to each other and the questions they ask make so much more sense now, because now they're asking questions not only, what is the grandest version of this theory that I could possibly come up with, but how can I make this simple and codified and have a stable vocabulary so I don't accidentally confuse students. That's what I've realized I do. If I don't have
Yep.
a stable vocabulary, because I'm just thinking of images in my head, then the
Yep.
students get confused because they don't see
Yep.
what's going on inside my head.
Yep.
But
And it's
yeah.
the same for preachers because you leave seminary and you've, again, played with all these ideas and then you get into a church and suddenly you've got just a group of people out in front of you who many of whom have spent very little time during the week thinking about what you think is so central and important and you somehow have to connect these two worlds for them and in a sermon usually in somewhere between 20 and 40 minutes and so
Hmm.
that's your shot and the audience too it isn't let's say um, a sample size of men and women between the ages of 18 and 22 with almost assuredly IQs north of 100. it's, illiterate and PhDs and men and women and children and people who are hard. I mean, but I think that's part of what makes just the work of local ministry really, I think think it makes that work fruitful, even in terms of the life of the mind. So,
Mhm.
because
And
it always stretches you.
and I should mention that Eastern is a great school too, and that I have great colleagues who are all some of them are have been teachers for a long time, some of them are also relatively new teachers. So we've got a great group of people all focused on the students, which is great.
Now, it used to be Eastern College, and they
Right.
grew
Yeah.
out of the Mennonite tradition.
No, originally they were called Eastern Baptist College. I don't
Oh,
know, I mean, this
Baptist.
is yeah, I knew this all from the Wikipedia page before I did my interview. But they were originally the Eastern Baptist College, and then at some point became Eastern College, maybe about 50 years ago or something like
Yeah,
that, and sort of branched out. So to branch out to more non-Baptist students. And then maybe 20 years ago, Eastern University, after they started adding some graduate programs.
right.
But there's still some sort of affiliation with, I believe, the American Baptists
Oh, okay.
and Palmer Seminary, which is here, is predominantly a Baptist seminary. Yeah.
And especially if it's associated with the American Baptist, it would be more mainline-ish than
Yeah.
evangelical fundamental. Yep.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But in terms of the faculty and what branches of Christianity they come, it's a very broad uniform distribution, which I think is really healthy and really good.
Okay.
Ecumenical in the true sense,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. Yeah. In the original sense.
Yes, yeah,
Um,
exactly.
at least the 20th century sense. So, well, did you want to talk about that video that you sent me, or
Yeah, so
what's on your mind?
I guess the video that I sent you is I guess it would be at the time of the publication of this probably the most recent video on the Econ Playground, but I guess you can put a link below, which is a paper that I'm working on with a friend of mine, Tegan Truitt, who just started as a finance professor at Grove City College. And it's sort of marrying two different streams of my research that I found interesting. One, which was historical religious institutions. That's what I did my dissertation on, was on monasticism. But then the other is just institutions in general, how they function, and
Yeah.
specifically the role of, I guess I'd say, the role of rules and the limits of rules,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
In that rules, public codes, formal systems and things like that, we use these things to help interface with one another, but also in a sense to interface with the world. A scientific theory is a sort of a system that I use to cooperate with the world, or a religious system is one which I use to cooperate with God. Sort of the social relationship between the church and God is expressed sometimes in rules, but rules are limited, is the idea.
Yep.
So originally, that line of research came out from thinking about these issues in economics between what matters more, material causes or material interests, or ideas, and or people's higher motivations or ideals or things like that, right? And these two kinds of explanations seem mutually exclusive from one another. But one of my favorite books, which I have videos on the Econ Playground, is called Law and Revolution by the Harvard law professor Harold Berman, and it's basically about the history of the Western legal tradition. And he's very clear in that book. He goes, "I'm not a social scientist. I'm a lawyer, right? So I know that both of you camps are wrong, right? Law, right? Law, by definition, is ideal. It's an abstraction,
Yeah.
right? It's an attempt to express certain principles or ideals for social coordination, but we also understand that it only works if it applies in practice,
Right.
right? There's no purely ideal law and there's no purely practical law. Law is one of those human institutions that's the marriage of those two aspects of our reality, our spiritual and material reality, you might
Yep.
say, right?
Yep.
So in a sense, what me and my friend Curtis, who I wrote that paper with, who's on the job market, by the way, to get if anyone's hiring, basically was to say, okay, well, we can sort of express this problem by saying, let's assume we're in a position where everything is governed by material laws and people are operating under different sets of rules. When do these rules end up failing, right? Every set of rules is in some way incomplete. So you're going to run into a situation in which those rules don't specify how do we coordinate in this location. So what do people do in those situations? Does the world just explode? Do we end up with complete chaos, right? Or is there something else that can be introduced that will sort of resolve the situation, right? A higher ideal or something like that. But that higher ideal can't be expressed purely in formal language, or else we would have run into the same exact problem, right? That system plus the idea is incomplete on some margin, right? So that higher ideal can't be expressed. It has to be understood or held like a spirit in the people or something like that. And that process is also informing or motivating or guiding people through various situations. Um, but in many cases, it needs to be complemented with rules, right? It needs to be given a formal, clear structure, or else it becomes too ambiguous and vague.
Yeah. Well, rules, once they're articulated and once they're sort of externalized, in the video you contrasted, let's say, rules from, let's say, human hierarchies from, let's say, human councils, which is a hierarchical, it's sort of councils are sort of blending of hierarchy and equality.
Hmm.
Um, Rules, of course, once they're externalized, they have the benefit of being impersonal in that, for example, if you read the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness against your neighbor. I mean, they're just out there, and especially once they're articulated in a liturgical language form, that they take on a degree of power, and then once they're agreed upon with the group, and sort of you get the blending of both of those worlds then, and
Hmm.
of course all of these things are blendings of worlds that where it's internal, external, and the way that you approached it in your video, religions are always. I just, in fact, on Twitter this morning, there was somebody had posted, it was Twitter or Substack, it might have been Substack. Someone was making the point that um, with the sort of young male crisis that's getting chatted about now, especially with all the hubbub around Nick Fuentes and Groypers, et cetera, et cetera. One of the questions is, well, what to do about others that, let's
Hmm.
say, are violating rules that we thought were sort of understood, universally accepted. Everyone's playing by these rules, and then you've got individuals who decide they are no longer going to play by these rules. They're going to say things that are against the rules. They're going to do things that are against the rules. A common one in churches is churches have implicit and explicit rules regarding human sexual behavior. Sexual behavior is obviously something that human beings cheat on because the rules, as many rules do, these rules impinge, they limit, and this either it was a Substack or a tweet or an article. It was basically about suffering, in that
Hmm.
part of the problem is that we have not taught people how to suffer, and that in fact, suffering is an obligation that all of us have for the sake of the group, and that's where you get all of these classic free rider problems and commons issues and those kinds of things. So I liked your video, especially just mentioning Sam and Luke and their right now it's kind of a classic conversation about confessionalism, where Sam and Luke, both of whom find themselves sort of found themselves outside of communities that they very much wanted to participate in, and both of whom participated in an enthusiastic. They were good participants. They weren't
Hmm.
they weren't free riders at all in many respects. But part of the question is, of course, with rules, you have this question of relevance. Do what does it, and of course the ongoing conversation with respect to human sexuality, especially since the sexual revolution, which basically pitched to the world that these rules are not relevant to the performance of the community. Rules against
Hmm.
same-sex behavior,
Hmm.
rules against adultery. We can leave these rules go, and the community will function just fine. And then you can point to all sorts of examples in church history where rules that were once held tightly were then abandoned, and it seemed the community did just fine. We
Hmm.
can look at usury laws, where famously under Calvinism, some of the link between Calvinism and capitalism. Now money can be
Yeah.
used as
Max
a
Weber. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And now money can be used for profit. And you must lend to your neighbor without interest if they need your cloak or need shelter or need food. But if they are
Hmm.
going to invest this money in some foreign endeavor, expecting to receive a return, you should be entitled to a portion of that return. And so this rule that governed for a very long time was relaxed, and people looked at the impact of relaxing that rule and said life is much better with this rule gone. And that
Mm.
same argument was made with respect to, let's say, same-sex marriage. Life is much better if we tried to have gay
Hmm.
people act like heterosexual pair bonded people in lifelong monogamous commitments. But then there's all the free rider questions about, well, what is it? Is it in fact um, reasonable to ask gay men to have monogamous relationships instead of open relationships? Is an open relationship the same? I mean, and that's where you get to your point of
Hmm.
rules, which is that rules are really nice in that they're external. We can see them. You and I can both agree to them and look at them, and they're apart from any individual. But novel situations come in board, like the invention of same-sex marriage. There's a novel situation. Other situations come in where it's like, well, he is spending a lot of time with this woman, but his wife is in a memory care unit and will probably be dead in a year or two. And so we're going to not ask too many questions whether or not they're doing anything sexually, but they are spending a lot of time together and they're sitting next to each other in church, and there seems to be a level of intimacy growing. So should the elders talk about adultery with respect to these two, because now we're going to expand the definition of adultery to emotional relationships, not just sexual. I mean, that's sort of the realm
Yeah.
of rules.
So yeah, and I like that you bring up Sam and Luke and that they are not free riders because that's exactly the kind of point that I was trying to say. In economics, there's usually this focus on who has the incentive to do this or that, right?
Right,
But what I'm saying is that especially in the religious environment, there's also this question of, yeah, you can draw a model where people have the incentive to commit to a group, but a major obstacle to people committing to a specific group is what they know that they're going to commit to, especially if
right,
they're committing for the lifetime, right?
right.
There's already problems of, oh, am I going to buy a burger? Is it going to taste exactly the way I want it, right? There's a much different question. I'm going to join this church. Is it going to stay the same for my entire lifetime, right? So you really care about how it's governed. It's very analogous
Stay the
to
same in the
marriage,
way
right?
I want it to stay the same.
Yeah, yeah.
You
Or
because
at
they're going to
least,
want it to change in other ways too.
yeah, at least in the ways that it's changed, it's guided by truth or something like
Right,
that, right?
right.
Hopefully,
Or
hopefully.
the Bible, or the hierarchy,
Yes,
or
but
the
the idea is
community.
Bible or hierarchy or community, those are different proxies for the truth, right?
Right,
And so the idea of the model and the way that we might want to take it forward is in different environments, those different proxies have their upsides more revealed or less revealed, I guess, is a way of putting it, right?
yep,
But
yep.
so actually, I wrote a whole piece of paper here, a bunch of things I wanted to say.
Oh,
So
go for it.
do you mind if I go through a couple of them quickly? Yeah. Okay, so first, I'll ask you this question, which is sort of a testing question to see how you what this term means to you or why you think about it. The term double standard. We almost every time we say something is a double standard,
Right,
okay? What do we mean and why do we think that's bad?
right. Well, the one of the double standards that often gets pointed out is that historically men men's adulterous behavior
Hmm.
was sort of accepted, not publicly, but implicitly, and women's was condemned. And you see that, for example, in the Gospel of Luke, where there's a woman caught in adultery. Now, obviously, adultery is something you can't do by yourself. And so the question is, assuming, where's the dude? And the dude
Hmm.
isn't there. And so there's a double standard. And so it's double standards are ways in which there are free riders or cheaters on rules.
Hmm.
And
So
and
in
and
yeah.
and within actually within because maybe the person has hierarchy, the person has wealth, or the person has, let's say, they're of a separate gender or a separate community or separate race. That's sort of where these things have boiled down, at least in the 20th
Mhm.
century.
So I guess the issue though is you could articulate a double standard, but still keep it within some sort of consistent framework. So with respect to who gets to go into which bathroom, putting the transgender issue aside, the
Yep.
question of who gets to go in which bathroom, we have a double standard, right?
Yes.
Oh, who can
Yes.
go through this door? Men can, women can't. Who can go through this
Right.
door? Women can, men can't, right?
Right.
And that's a double standard, but we have an overarching rule that is clear that this standard applies in this case and this standard applies in this case.
Right.
So what we call a double standard is when we have two rules, and sometimes we're not clear about which one applies in which case. And
Right.
so sort of a thesis that I'm putting forward, or a hypothesis, and then I'll spend the next 20 years trying to prove it, is that what modernity is an allergy to double standards, right? When there's a double standard in some situation, we implicitly just reject it, even before we even try to meditate on whether or not this is the
Yep.
right standard. And for in many cases that's the right thing to do, but in many cases you're rejecting this double standard prematurely, perhaps,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
So put a pin in that. I guess the way that the paper I mentioned that I'm doing with Curtis, we're moving on into another project now that we're focusing not really on just the question of rules and then when do rules fail, but what different kinds of rules there are in different environments.
Right.
And so if you think in terms of a system as a whole, a system is a set of formal principles or ideas or logics or mathematics or something like that that you try to input something and get a response out, right?
Right.
So a scientific model or system, Newton's system, you put in certain initial conditions and you get out where the ball is
Yep.
going to be located after a certain period of time, right?
Yep.
So,
And an example of this would be keep your clothes on. Don't take
mhm,
off your clothes in front of strangers unless you're at the doctor's office. So suddenly,
mhm,
when you're at the doctor's office, there's this whole different set of rules where the doctor is putting his fingers and looking and doing all these things that if
mhm,
I did this with anybody else, let's say with the possible exception of my wife, depending on what the doctor's doing, suddenly I'm out of a job, I've lost status, all of these things, but I go to the
mhm.
doctor and this man does things to me and it's like nobody cares.
Yeah, or at the beach,
Or
right,
at
or
the
something like
beach.
that. But
Yeah,
that
yeah.
one has shifted over time as well. So the point though that then we want to say is that systems can have two different characteristics, which we sort of posit are in tension with each other, right? So
Hmm.
one is consistency, right?
Hmm.
Consistency is the idea that every time I put a situation into this system, I get the same output,
Yep.
right? So in mathematical terms, this is the vertical line test for a function,
Yep.
right? X always means this Y. It never means that Y or the other Y,
Right.
right? X always means this Y. That's consistency,
Yep.
right? That's useful. The other one is completeness, right? So the breadth of domain. How many different X's can I put into this system and get a Y out,
Right.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's some sense in which these two things are in tension with each other, right?
Yep.
And I don't have the mathematical or philosophical chops to prove that, but you can sort of see it in many different domains. A very simple version of it would be something like if you want to cover more bases, if you want to cover more cases, you need to start adding more rules. The more rules you add, the
Right.
more likely it is that two of those are going to conflict at some point.
Right.
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 And so the legal system is hopefully this big massaging system to try to add as many laws to cover as many cases as you can,
Yep.
right, without accidentally adding a contradiction. And then the legal system, which however you have designed it, is designed to massage through those inconsistencies.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
Okay.
And again, with the
So,
doctor's office, the domain of the doctor's office is different from just about every other domain in my life. And so you have
mhm,
all of these, and this is also deeply. At one point, I want to talk to you about this word modernity because one of the videos that I'm thinking about doing is I'm reading Abram Kuyper's Stone lectures
oh,
from 1898. And when he talks about modernity, it's very clear he is talking about something very different from, let's say, what Paul Kingsnorth is talking about. And so
mhm,
this question of that word, but clearly there's this element of modernity that very much has an allergy to double standards, has an affinity to consistency because that's what it's desiring, and that consistency then has the difficulty of Well, you're also then going to have to deal with domains. You're going to have to
Hmm.
deal with, because if you do this thing, you get this result, great, one-to-one relationship. But when there's this other thing happening, I was just reading in World War One, the first attempt to use gas in warfare in the First World War was the Germans against the Russians. What they didn't know was that that particular gas was ineffective below certain temperatures. And of course, you're in Eastern Europe, and the temperatures, it was very cold, and so they released the gas, and the Russians didn't even notice it because so the domain, they didn't understand that the domain of the effectiveness of this gas was within a temperature framework that hadn't occurred
Hmm.
to them, so mission failed.
Hmm. Yeah, so like I had an earlier version of this presentation that I gave last May that had some problems with it. But in that presentation, we were saying a quintessential consistent system is the rules of chess, right? No two people playing chess, if they know the rules of chess, are going to disagree on whether a given move is legal or illegal. I mean, people could
Right.
do whatever they want with their hands and the pieces, but we're
Yep.
going to agree, was that legal or illegal? Right? Unless you're
Yep.
dealing with a little kid that doesn't know the rules,
Yep.
right? But the rules of chess do not help me on the basketball court know what
Right.
is legal or illegal, except by some sort of broad universal analogy of fairness or something like that,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Whereas on the other hand, a system which is complete, we can always get an answer, but is very inconsistent, is the will of a 2-year-old, right? If we say that our household is governed by the 2-year-old for the day, right? He's going to give us instructions on what are we going to do, but it's going to be constantly changing which instructions. So we're going to have to keep going back and forth to him, right?
Yep.
So this consistency and completeness trade-off is basically what I was talking about in the video as the rules versus hierarchy trade-off, right?
Yep.
And each one of those systems has its downsides, right? And
Yep.
so in the original paper that we did, we said the problem of incompleteness leads to awkwardness, right? So it's an incompleteness leads to an A, an awkwardness, right? And so if we have rules, and these typically govern how we operate in various situations, but then we end up in a spot where we don't know how the rules govern this situation, it's awkward. So it's not an immediate collapse of civilization, right? But it's an awkward moment. Okay.
Yep. Yep.
Whereas inconsistency leads to another A, which is bad, arbitrariness, right? Where we know that we can use a system here to solve the problem, but I don't know what the system is going to spit out, right?
Now you're
So
the
we
one that
know,
poked at that arbitrary word. So are you
yes,
using it sort of in
yes.
the common way, or do you have a better word than that? Because
I,
I've rarely
I
liked your insight in that.
I did this presentation before I made that. I noticed that basically. But I use it in the common pejorative way here,
Okay.
in
Yep.
that I don't know who's gonna what the outcome is gonna be, right?
It's irrational, you might say. That would be sort of
Yeah,
another.
maybe irrational, yeah. But I really like the I to A
Yeah.
thing, the
Yeah.
the double alliteration. Um, But so anyway, so the idea is that these we can, if we have some sort of choice, or we can lean in one direction, we can have systems that are more consistent, or we can lean in another direction, we can have systems that are more complete. Those two relevant downsides, right? If those change for some reason, then we might lean more into one system. And so what I'm basically positing with the double standard idea too is that modernity is a leaning into wanting our systems to be more consistent in a broad number of domains.
Yeah.
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 So it's the modernity is an allergy to double standards, but it's also an affinity to consistency, right?
Yeah.
In many different cases, right? So three different main places where you might say that, well, and I guess it's unclear to me exactly what the causes of this, the timing causes of this. The first main one is obviously the printing press, right? In that if we now have broader literacy and we can spread rules wider, it's much easier for us to have and to expect everyone else to have common access to consistent rules, right?
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
just easier to run more consistent rule systems,
Yeah.
right? In a in
Yeah.
a in a mechanical sense. The second one, and this is one that I think a lot of people underrate with respect to the rise of Protestantism, is the rise of the state in the 15th century. So prior to Protestantism, prior to Martin Luther, right? It's not like something happened in 1517 that changed the whole world forever. It was something that was slowly bubbling, right?
Yeah.
So the introduction of the cannon into Western Europe totally changes warfare completely, right?
Yep.
Instead of having many individual castles and then a relatively weak king who just has to rally one group of castle guys together every 25, 35 years or so to fight a war or to go on an expedition or to go on crusade, right? Now, if you can bring one cannon in, you can destroy any of these castles, right? So in order to have an effective defensive army, you need one person who has control of a standing army at all times for defensive purposes, not just for offensive
Mm,
purposes, right? So there becomes all of a sudden, the medieval systems, the king had a lot of power that you might, and there was a lot of dangers to his arbitrariness,
yeah.
right? But the dangers are magnified many, many times now, right? Because you can have so much concentration of violence capacity in one person, right? And this also affects then the relationship between, and this is what I mentioned basically in the video. This affects the relationship between the papacy and all of these various kings, right?
Yeah.
Because, well, everyone knows the famous story. Henry, got upset that his divorce wasn't being offered or his divorce wasn't being granted by the Pope. But
Right.
what most people forget is that his wife, he was trying to divorce, her cousin was Charles V, who had just recently sacked Rome, right? That kind of thing, where a king could literally physically put his thumb on the scales in Rome, was not the case for many centuries before.
Yeah.
So the arbitrariness of in the Catholic system of the Pope is now much more of a danger than it was in previous centuries, right?
Yeah.
So the fact that okay, we need to get our consistency now, right, is a reason that you might say, hey, let's just stick to what the Bible says.
Yeah.
Or let's just have our relatively clear set of creeds and canons and then obey those. We're not obeying some bishop who we don't know who he's associated with and who's controlling him, et cetera,
Yeah.
right? So, in that sense, the rise of the state and the rise of the printing press makes it much easier for us as a society in religion, let's say first, to lean into a consistent system, a rules-based system, or a non-hierarchical system. But that means that we're going to have to eat the costs of the awkwardness, or we're going to have to deal with more awkwardness than we dealt with in the past,
Yeah.
right? It's
Yeah.
worth it to buy the consistency now and deal with the awkwardness later,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
Yeah, and that's basically what I cover in the Creedal and Completeness video. That's basically also what I think Taylor's Secular Age is mostly about, in some sense, in that he's saying that the medieval worldview, the porous worldview that people
Right.
talk about a lot, is that there's a system that we use to understand the heavens and religion, and then a system that we use to understand the world below,
Hmm.
right? And we know that in certain cases, angels interact with humans, humans are divine, have the image of God in some way. We know that these systems overlap with each other, but we don't know exactly how they overlap. Right? We
Hmm.
don't know the
Hmm.
exact way in which they overlap. So there's inconsistency there,
Right.
but we have a broader sense of the world, right?
Right.
So modernity, as it starts to lean into this need for consistency, says we're going to have one consistent system, right?
Right.
And if that means that we have a earth only system, a matter only system, damn the other system, right? We just
Right.
need consistency in one. If that means we're going to have a spirit only system, right?
Right.
And a German idealist kind of system, we're going to pick that one and damn the other one, right?
Right.
So you end up with this really strong oscillation between one consistent system or another consistent system instead of the idea that he talks about in the pre-modern age where you're trying to hold multiple systems together,
Right.
even though they may be inconsistent, right?
Right. That
That's
is
the
super
way I think of it.
interesting. The because oh boy, there's so much there. There's a lot of God number one and God number two there
Hmm.
because I mean, basically the difference between God number one and God number two is the sort of the personal and the impersonal. God number one is Arenic. God number two is Agentic. And you've also got the development of if you read, say, C.S. Lewis's Discarded Order, Taylor is right. There's sort of
Discarded
two
image.
discarded image.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Yeah,
There's
exactly.
two
Exactly.
realms, and part of what the discovery of the telescope, um, basically, once people begin to assert and um, people begin to assert and demonstrate that the mechanics above and the mechanics below are part of the same system. All of if you look at, let's say, the moonshot, all of those mechanics, the physics work the same in both places. Now,
Hmm.
so in other words, it's a very complete system. Newtonian
Hmm.
physics, especially until the early 20th century, Newtonian physics seems to be a very complete system
Hmm.
that you need to understand gravity and force and velocity and all of these things, and you can pierce the realm in a sense, and you can send a spacecraft up to explore the rings of Saturn, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Hmm.
And so that was that's a big piece in modernity's favor. And what seems to be happening now, part of the reason Jonathan Peugeot talks about the fact that when he first started talking, he just thought nobody's ever going to understand me. And then, of course, he meets Peterson, and Peugeot and Peterson begin to understand each other. And then Peugeot begins to be understood broadly. Part of that revolution that has been happening in terms of epistemology, you can maybe see it in physics because even though you could say the word quantum, that's part of
Hmm.
common parlance now, but I forget who was mentioning it. Most people still basically live in a Newtonian framework because that's sort of where we're at. This, you know, this little piece of a tripod, falls at a very consistent rate and it
Hmm.
feels very solid, even though at some theoretical level, I might try to imagine that there's actually more space in this solid than there are particles. But that's the same of
Hmm.
my hands. But I mean, all that then becomes this very, again, there's almost we're entering more and more into once again two-stage worlds where there's
Hmm.
sort of this Newtonian world where yeah, I can feel that. But then there's this other world where we're saying, well, actually, there's a different set of physics going on here. And that set of physics is increasingly governed by that which threatens to bring apocalypse on the world, which are, let's say, nuclear
Hmm.
weapons or thermonuclear
Yeah.
weapons. So it's interesting how in modernity, the world sort of comes together. And so we can say that whole world up there, usury. Um, in fact, again, a video that I hope to do today, if Freddie allows me, is um, it's all about this question of governance. Because in modernity, we seem to be governed mostly by basically the assertion is that this consistent world is complete. And the new
Hmm.
atheists come along and say, there's one world, it's complete. C.S. Lewis called it the whole show. There it
Hmm.
is. And
The,
increasingly,
the God of the gaps, basically arguing against the God of the gaps, is
right,
saying, well, we have this assumption that the world is consistent. If you show a counterexample, I can sh we have a faith that eventually we will be able to include it in the same consistent system.
that's right.
And and in a sense that faith can be shown to be faulty in many
Right.
locations.
And
Yeah.
right now I think is increasingly being demonstrated to be faulty, which is
Yeah.
why you're getting this movement now sort of swinging the other way towards, for lack of a better word, towards religion. People are
Hmm.
going back to church. People are praying. People are, but even in other realms, New Age is growing. People are becoming they're becoming more spiritual, more religious, and there's a crisis of confidence that this one consistent world of Newtonian mechanics is in fact
Hmm.
complete, and that in fact there are other things governing it that we do not know or understand.
Yeah. And now, and so I shouldn't accidentally mistake or mistakenly say something, and that it is possible, like Newtonian physics is an achievement, a genuine achievement,
Yes,
in that he develops a new system which is consistent in new ways and complete in new ways. So
yes,
in economics, we'd call this not a movement within the production possibility curve. It's not trading off apples for oranges. It's figuring out a way to get both more apples and more oranges.
yes,
Right.
yes,
And so in that sense, that insight of his is a genuine contribution. It's not giving up one thing for another. It's leaning further into and actually discovering something, right?
absolutely.
So w
And
one way of yeah,
Well, and
the
technology is, I mean, anyone, if they
mhm,
have the sufficient resources and material and organization and technology, can participate in the destruction of castles. And so in
mhm,
that way, it's a consistent governing.
mhm,
And it just gets, and there are incredible incentives to adopt that worldview and live in that world.
hmm So, and now, just one quick thing too about Weber is that a lot of people don't understand about his Protestant work ethic argument, which I think has flaws, and it's not a sufficient argument of the existence of capitalism by any means. But a lot of people focus on this strange argument that he has about predestination. So
Yeah.
that this is the common way that you hear Weber's
Yep.
argument is something like,
Yep.
well, Calvinists believed in predestination.
Right.
And so they knew you were elect or unelect, but then
Right.
they also believed that if you were elect on earth, you got these benefits. So
Yep.
this is them sort of like trying to cheat the prestige of predestination by
Yeah.
working harder. And
Yeah.
that's the way that people summarize Weber, but it's
Yeah.
like a half a page of the book. It's like most of the book is about him saying that what Protestantism did is it took the spirit of the monasteries of the Middle Ages, which you might say are islands of consistency
Yep.
in a sea of completeness of the Middle Ages,
Yep.
right? And imposing them on the whole world, right? Which
Yeah.
is the same thing that Voltaire says about the monasteries. He says that Luther and Calvin broke open the monasteries and convents so that they could turn the whole world into a monastery or a convent,
Well, that's
right?
pretty much what Taylor says as well. I
Yeah,
mean,
exactly. Yeah,
because there was a two-speed religion, and Taylor
yeah.
says what Protestants do is basically say, no, there's one-speed religion, which again is consistent with modernity. We're going from a two-level world to a one-level world,
Or a
and
double standard to a single
right.
standard.
And I've
Yeah.
and I've and I've never liked that argument with respect to predestination, partly because, and it just could be an accident of the Calvinists that I've been around my whole life. I never found that argument actually moving in the lives of very many real Calvinists. In
Yeah.
fact,
Yeah.
I always saw, at least within the Dutch Calvinist tradition, and now the Dutch are very close to capitalism and all of this stuff, of course, but with the Dutch Calvinists, predestination is actually works in the other way, in
hmm
that I can endure suffering because I my salvation is secure. In other words, the hope
Yeah.
of blessedness and afterlife. I mean, when I hear that argument, I really see prosperity gospel, where
hmm
there's a very deep relationship between prosperity in this world and prosperity in the next world, which is, I think, basically what I often call common religion, which is basically karma. You know you're
hmm
in the favor of the gods if your children prosper and you have lots of money and you never suffer misfortune.
hmm
And it's basically in alignment with, I went to Italy a couple of years ago, and if you go to the Naples Museum, you find everybody it seemed had a little statue to the goddess Fortune,
hmm
because they all want to eat. They all want their children to do well. They all want, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's the most popular religion around. And what predestination basically says is you can suffer loss in this world because you have confidence that you are in God's hand. And so that's why I'd
hmm
often listen to that argument. I'd think, is that true of ancient Calvinists? I don't know. It doesn't seem to be true of the Calvinists I know.
Yeah. Well, you're in good company because I think that's closer to what Weber is actually saying in the original, right? But
Interesting.
but his idea is that what he calls it otherworldly and I'm not too sure about his categories, but he calls it the otherworldly asceticism of the monastics becomes the this worldly asceticism of the Protestants, right? In that their asceticism is to be expressed sort of in a flat way across all domains of life. And in some cases, this is related to that initial argument in that, well, the monks say that they're following these rules, but we don't even have people watching them and understanding them. And if we have this big state now, many of the Protestant states, the first things they do is capture all of the monasteries. So
Yep.
the monasteries are no longer nearly as economically, politically independent after the rise of the state than they are in the medieval era, right?
Right.
So they're even though they're supposedly governed by rules, they're a source of arbitrariness instead. So
Yeah.
we want to impose that benefit that the monastic life imposes on the world. We want to impose it across all people in a flat way, is the idea.
And in fact, they want to perfect it because today, when we look at monks, we look at them as these are really exceptional people because they have sacrificed a lot. And so, therefore, that's a signal that they are probably not cheaters
hmm
and freeloaders. But in in the period of the Reformation, many people thought the monastic life was fundamentally corrupt. And there was, and that doesn't mean that all monks
Hmm.
were corrupt. There were certainly many genuine, heartfelt monks. But remember, Luther was a monk. And when he
Hmm.
condemns the monastic lifestyle, obviously there's a lot of complicated things in there, but part of the reason that if so maybe the individuals take vows of poverty, but the enthusiasm had collected a tremendous amount of wealth sufficient to the fact
Hmm.
that if the monks were actually poor, well, the king wouldn't have had any reason to take all their property because they wouldn't have had
Hmm.
any. But they had
Yeah.
plenty, and so the kings are like, "We'll take all of this. Thank you very much."
Hmm. Hmm. And well, this is going off a little bit, but this is another paper that we're working on, basically arguing that one of the main effects of Henry, especially taking all that land, is that then that land was distributed into the pockets of many different rising gentry, and then those rising gentry become the Protestant elite of the next generation and stop Mary
Wow.
from coming back in and stuff like that, right?
Double
Um,
standard.
yeah. But okay, so then outside of religion, though, in another domain, in political thought, how what else starts to change in modernity? The most dominant political metaphor of the modern age is probably the social contract,
Yes.
right? And in some sense, the social contract is just a description of what we owe each other in this world, right? Which is not new to modernity, right? And any almost all political thought back to Plato and before, right, is some sort of description of the obligations that different groups have to one another and the responsibilities and things like that. But the contract metaphor is a notion that, hey, maybe we can actually articulate these things as clear rules. Right,
Right.
etc.
Right.
Right. So
Right.
this becomes if what modernity is a demand for consistency, it's not just a demand for social order, but a social contract, right?
Yes.
So most people think of the social contract as coming out of, well, the defining idea of modernity is that individuals have rights, right? So a social contract is something that you consent to. So
Yep.
we want something that all the people have consented to, but nobody has consented to their government in the last 500 years, right?
Right.
Practically nobody. So it's not that's not really the focus. What people got to remember is, yeah, social contract comes with Hobbes and Leviathan, right? This guy is not letting anyone, he's not asking for anyone's consent,
No.
when he's doing whatever he's doing. So, what I think is much more dominant in modernity is this idea of a demand for consistency or generality in the rules. So
Yes.
that's also, I put a bunch of books out here because I knew I'd be grabbing them. This is what a book my advisor wrote, Persecution and Toleration, basically saying the rise of modernity or modern political systems or liberal political systems is one in which there are general rules which apply to all. And so in
Yeah.
this sense, this is the quintessential idea of modern political systems is that they're
Right.
articulated in terms of general rules, whether those are written down
Yeah.
like in the US Constitution or not,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Or one of the most famous books in economic history and political science in the last 15 years is Violence and Social Orders by North Wallis and Weingast, basically saying that what the modern era is they figured out how to have political institutions which are articulated in general rules and thus allow open access of all different classes of individuals, right? It's
Yeah.
not one rule for this group, one rule for
Yep.
this group, one rule for
Yep.
this group,
Yep.
right? That creates order, right? That
Yep.
creates some degree of stability,
Yep.
but it doesn't allow for people to move through these gates in a different way.
Right.
So the thing that most people think is what modernity contributed to political science or political theory, something like equality or
Yep.
natural rights or something
Yep.
like that. Those are not new ideas, but consistency means that that equality now needs to be expressed in a new way. We
Yes.
all follow the same exact rule. And so
Yes.
modernity moving into new domains, into gender, into race, is that we can never have rules conditional on gender, or we
Right.
can never have rules conditional on race or sexual orientation or national origin, or you can keep going and keep going and keep going,
Right.
right?
Right.
Beyond the borders of where it's reasonable, actually, right?
And it's dependent on the abstraction as each individual human being is sort of a is an individual. They are a widget.
Hmm.
They are on and part of I was having a conversation with someone who had also lived overseas for a while or tried it and had family that had one of the things that shocks people is that part of the reason for immigration into a place like the West, where you have this order, is that immigrants at least have the hope and a reasonable amount of understanding that perhaps many of the traditional structures of the countries that they have left will not be in the new place. For example,
Hmm.
if there are many countries in the world that I can go to, and even if I come in with certain privileges, such as I go to Latin America and people look at me, they're like, oh, well, right away they think, well, you're wealthy and all of these things. So I'm going to get a certain amount of deference. But if I decide, okay, I'm going to buy property in this Latin American country and I am going to try to set up industry and I'm going to compete, let's say I'm going to go to the Dominican Republic and I'm going to establish a thriving dairy industry. Chances are good it's going to get squashed. Why?
Mm,
Because the Dominican Republic is sort of ruled by this familial network that it doesn't matter whether I can produce milk more cheaply or eggs more cheaply than they can. It matters that I don't have the right last name. And of
mhm,
course, with the crisis in the Christian Reformed Church in the 1970s, culminating in the time to burn the wooden shoes on the cover of the banner in 1980, well, that was the crisis because the idea was no, the Christian Reformed Church has to become a modern church and an anti racist church in that we're no longer going to have the privilege of the family networks of the Dutch last names. And, it's just fascinating watching all of these things spin around. But then again, you have people like Louise Perry or Mary Harrington that basically say this system with respect to sex hasn't really worked because and then it gets really complicated because on one hand, even in the modern period, women were regarded with special rules and special privileges, even while at the same time they were called things like the weaker sex. And so then with the rise of the girl boss, suddenly it's like,
mhm.
you know, if all the men are going to use all of the tools they have traditionally used with each other now against you, no, no, that's not fair. Well, why not? You're not a woman, you're a
Mhm.
widget. And if you're not a woman, you're a widget. I can treat you like I've always treated the other widgets that have dominated the competitive realms in which I
Yeah,
have
exactly,
competed.
exactly. Yeah. So there has to be this new for everyone to fit perfectly into the consistent rules, there has to be a small emptying out of personality or individuality,
That's
which
right.
is underrated, which people underrate often, right?
Right.
Now it's not yeah, okay, okay. Well, I'll get to that in a second. So, something that you said about people moving into the DR, right? That I've been reading a little bit about the since moving back into this area, I wanted to learn more local history than I got growing up. So I started reading the chapter of the book Albion's Seed, which is
Oh
a
yeah.
famous book. Yeah,
Yeah.
I started reading just the chapter on the Quakers, right? Because
Yep.
I'm very interested in them and stuff like that. So
Yep.
in terms of the model that was in my video, they would definitely be a rules governed for the
Yep.
most part, but also partially council governed
Yep.
organization, right?
Yep.
In the family structure, maybe more hierarchical, right?
Yep.
But at the community level, definitely rules governed and council governed, right?
Yep.
Which means that they are very vulnerable to that awkwardness question, right?
Yep.
They're
Yep.
very vulnerable to something that happens that would cause them to split apart. Something that I didn't realize, because today we'd think of the Quakers as maybe being one of the more left-wing mainline
Right.
denomination, right?
Right.
Quaker people that are Quaker today. But at the
Right.
time, they very, very strictly regulated sex and marriage. Right? Why? Because that determines what kind of people are in the community, right? And how many new people are entering into the community through sex. The Quakers had some of the lowest birth rates, right, of any other group, which was fascinating. So that's a way of we say, okay, we're committing to a rules-based organization. That means the problem that we're going to have is awkwardness, the incompleteness. Okay. So in order to minimize that cost, right, given that we picked the rules, that's the cost we have to deal with. Now we have to deal with that damage. So if we can regulate how many novel situations we deal with, we can minimize the damage in that direction, right? And so that might last for a long time, but as soon as you run into the problem, you split, right? And
Yep.
I just heard this from a Quaker guy that I talked to a couple of years ago who's was explaining what happened with the Quakers in the American Civil War, right? If you've ever seen the movie Friendly Persuasion, that's what this is basically about. It's like a 50s movie or something like that. And you can simply put it, if you're an abolitionist, but you're also a pacifist, the Civil War is very awkward. Right?
Yes.
Because everyone's like, oh, we're finally doing that thing you've been telling us to do for
Right.
150 years. We're trying to abolish slavery. We're going to go down. We're going to fight the South. Are you with us? No. What? What are you talking about? You were the one telling us to do this the whole time, right? So apparently what ended up happening is a bunch of young Quaker men said, screw it, I'm signing up, right? Or we're conscripted or something like that, right? And then when they come back, then they have all these marriage problems because the community doesn't want to readmit them and allow them to marry. So then the young women defect because then there's a huge sex ratio off, right? So they start to defect from Quaker communities. So Quakerism changed a lot because of the Civil War, right? In a similar
Wow.
way to how so many denominations have Southern Baptist Conference, Northern Baptist Conference
Yeah.
over that issue of the Civil War. So
Yeah.
all of these Protestant denominations in the U.S. Sort of faced their awkwardness in a time like the Civil War, right? You could
Wow.
think the American Constitution itself was
Yeah.
facing awkwardness in the time
Yes.
of the Civil War. We don't
Yes.
have protocols for secession, right?
Yes.
Um, Lincoln as the hierarch decided we're not allowing something like that to happen. And
Yeah.
so what happened happened. And you can say that's for better or for worse, mostly for the better, but it exposed a weakness in the Constitution. You have to admit that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So,
That is
yeah.
super interesting because I'd also read something with respect to the Quakers in the Philadelphia area where, I mean, part of what happens is that the Scotch Irish sort of
Oh,
move
yes,
into that
yes.
area. And of course, the Scotch Irish, they're not pacifists.
Yeah.
They and that's I also read a very interesting piece by Tyler Cowen who was making the point that um, even people who are, let's say, the most open to and celebrative with respect to immigration, the problems that they face, which are similar problems in that, let's say we're gonna let everyone in, and then you get this situation where Texas decides it's going to bus all of these undocumented people up to New York City and let them out there, and then people are like, hey, wait a minute, what's going and because and essentially what he was saying there are issues at every level of your immigration posture, and
Hmm.
it sort of determines either you're going to be hard on this end or you're going to wind up being doing things that you don't like to on that end, which is very
Yeah.
analogous to this Quaker question, which is yes, the slave should be freed. Well, are you willing to put your skin in the game? Well, yeah, but I'm not willing to put somebody else's skin in the game, having them be at the other end of the rifle.
Hmm. Yeah.
So that's
That's
super
what, and that's
interesting.
the kind of moments that he faces in the Friendly Persuasion movie. Like he's faced, well, could I kill a Southern soldier now or let him go and things like that, right?
Right.
Um, and with the Scotch Irish, they're the ones settling further in the West,
Yes.
and they're having to deal with a different group of Indians,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
so, but the Quakers in Philadelphia, they're the ones that actually are governing the colony, right? So
Yep. Yep. Yep.
you've got a
Yep.
big
Yep.
tension there, right?
Hang on a
Um,
second. Someone just knocked at my door. I'm going to pause this.
oh, okay.
There we go.
Um, yeah, well, what were we talking about? We were talking about the Quakers. Well, yeah, let me just say one other thing about another domain that we already basically kind of touched on, which is, I guess, science and philosophy in general, the Enlightenment, right?
Yeah.
The what we think of as modern empirical science is not different than pre-modern science in terms of the topic, but
Right.
more in the method that it takes to describe the world, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Newtonian physics describes the world in consistent mathematical formula,
Yep.
right? Which is to great advantage, but it limits the kind of things that it can talk about. And
Yep.
then this starts to move, especially in the 19th century, to starts to move into domains where you initially would not think it works, like social
Right.
sciences,
Right.
right? And so that in social science still today, much more than in physics, obviously, there's a much bigger tension between the qualitative and quantitative sides of the science,
Yep.
right?
Yep. I would imagine
But
that.
the idea that we can start to describe the world more and more in terms of numbers and quantities and formula, if we can describe the world that way, we can then build models of the world that are perfectly consistent, right?
Right.
And that would
Right.
be great.
Right.
And even in mathematics now, we're basically reaching the limits of, to the degree that math can itself describe itself in consistent terms,
Yep.
right?
Yep. Yep.
So I saw this on the shelf. I haven't read the whole book, but I just looked at it this morning. Is this book by Jerry Mueller called The Tyranny of Metrics, right? And this idea that there's almost a what he calls it metrics fixation, which is the idea that one takes as an assumption that if we can find a quantitative way to describe something, it's a better, more accurate way to describe it,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And then we lean further and further into that. There's also this book that I started looking at called Against the Gods: The Remarkable History of Risk.
Huh.
And the idea is one thing that I learned from that book that kind of summarizes the argument is that in the word probability, and I literally just saw this reading a letter from Hume. The word probability used to mean a an opinion which you ought to esteem, right? Oh,
Hmm.
I think that my guess about the future is a probable one, just meant like you should honor it or you should believe it is true, right? It was something more almost ethical about it, right? In that you should also believe this way, right? If
Hmm.
someone has a probable opinion. But then the word probability comes to mean a quantitative sort of assessment of which opinions are more probable, the one that we can assign a higher number to, right?
Yep. Yep.
So, oh, are we gonna roll a seven on the sum of two dice or a one? Seven is more probable, right? That something like that. So,
Way
but
more
the idea
probable
that
than a one.
yes, oh yeah, that's a zero. Yeah. Yeah. So that's everyone learned that in through Catan basically with those dots on the numbers in
Yep.
Catan,
Yep.
right?
Yep. Yep.
But yeah, and so but just the idea that even in this is not just about social interaction,
No.
right?
No.
There's also a sense in which if we can figure out a way, and I'm not sure how these two things are related actually, if we can figure out a way to describe consistently the world that we're experiencing,
Yep. Yep.
right?
Yep.
Not only just for ourselves, but well, not only for our communication with other people, but just for ourselves in terms of me solving an engineering problem or
Yep.
something like that.
Yep.
That's
Yep.
almost like cooperation with nature instead of
Yep.
cooperation with other individuals.
Yep.
Consistency in our cooperation with nature, right?
Yep.
But for the frontiersman or the cowboy that has to fight bears, right, a consistent theory is going to be useful to the extent that it's true,
Yep.
right? But for an animal which you've never seen before, I have no theory for this, you know?
Yep. Yep. Well, and when it comes to these massive shifts, so I made a video last week where I talked about, the problem of summation,
Mm-hmm.
where we have to you have this problem where on one hand, when you act, you have to make a decision when you act. Am I going to do this or am I going to do that? Or am I going to do one of these things on a menu? And in order to do that, we usually come to certain very rough summations about the whole world. And so I think part of what happens, especially with human beings in community as herds, is that we sort of move about with respect to these summations. And part of what happened in the rise of modernity is you had just all of these signals that were leaning towards, in McGilchrist terms, they were leading towards the emissary mind,
Mm-hmm.
that the managerial. When you look at, let's say, how the United States won the second, what beat the Japanese in the Second World War, it was we beat them in the factory before
Mm-hmm.
we ever went. And that was also true of the North in the Civil War. If you looked at industrialization, railroads, all these kinds of issues with respect to the North and the South in the Civil War, the southern states never really had a chance as long as there was sufficient will to crush
Mm-hmm.
them. And you've got a
And
similar
time.
in
Yeah.
time. And then you've got a similar system, a similar question with respect to, let's say, Russia and Ukraine right now. But the difficulty,
And actually with the Nazis too,
yes,
because
yes.
the Nazis they had it was during the Great Depression, the economy of the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany seemed great, in large part because, especially for the Soviet Union, they're insulated from international gold markets, so the effects of the depression are just not going to hit them at the same time.
Yep,
So communism, fascism, these seem like we have to pick one of these two. That's what it
yep,
seems like in the 30s, right? So
yep,
Keynesianism is in some way an answer to that, trying to provide some other solution to capitalism that is a middle road or something like that, right? But in early World War II, blitzkrieg, boom, we can act very quickly, right? We
yep,
can rally all our resources in a single direction. We can coordinate perfectly, right?
yep,
But over the long run, we can't actually make sure that our decisions are consistently good,
right.
right? Because we're so dependent on the Führer and himself, right?
Well, and then you've got questions of completeness. Because on one
Hmm.
hand, if you've got Ukraine and Russia, if that's sort of your system, those two, well, it's one thing. But to what degree is Ukraine tied to Europe and America? And and
Hmm.
and so all of these, in many ways, the consistency is always um, is always beholden to
Hmm.
completeness because
Yes.
it's always the question of domain. And of course, when you get into religion, I mean God, then God is just sort of by definition the thing that's on top. Now you've got basically all of these religious questions boil down to what's on top and does it
Hmm.
care? Um,
And in Ukraine, as if I've picked this up from God knows where, maybe a correct or incorrect source, that Ukraine, that word means something like the borderlands, right? The in between, something like that.
yeah,
That's a
yeah,
symbolism happens moment. If
yeah,
a war in the borderlands is what sort of exposes the incompleteness of the prior existing
yep,
global order, right?
yep, yep,
So
yep,
yeah.
yeah,
And well, you mentioned McGilchrist. That just is assumed at this point that that's relevant to this
yeah,
conversation, right? Because that's what
yeah.
that's basically his story in a sense. So I read his book over the summer. He has the first part of the book, which is describing these two mindsets, right? Or the left brain and right brain approaches, to use simple terms. The
His
second
smaller book
part
or his
is
latest book?
the
Master and the
Master and His
Emissary?
Emissary.
Okay,
Yeah,
yeah,
Master and His, that's the only one I read. Yeah.
okay,
Um, but the latter part starts with this thing where he says, well, I can explain how society has leaned more into one side of the brain without actually saying anything genetically is happening in terms of our brain, right?
right,
And he uses these imitation theories and social science theories about part of our behavior is from our brain, but part of it is also from imitating and copying social patterns from other people, right?
yep,
And
yep,
I guess what I'd like to crack a little bit more is why we lean left hemisphere when we do and in the way that we do. And that might be a better, broader explanation of something like modernity. But even so, even this question of so Curtis, the guy that I'm writing this stuff with, he's much more interested in the part of economic. He's not so much of a historian as I am. He's more interested in the or the what we'd call industrial organization questions. How is it that certain markets are organized, and how do firms organize themselves within those markets? But you can think of the question, and this is from a classic paper, Ronald Coase's The Nature of the Firm in 1937. You can think of the question of how do we produce this product, right? We could either have, many different independent contractors buying and selling parts from each other until the division of labor works itself out and we have a final product, right? The relationship between all of those producers is governed by rules and market prices, right? The contracts that they write. Or we could organize all of those individuals into a firm, right?
right,
And each one of them is given direction from an overseer or a manager, right?
right,
And in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, when he talks about the division of labor, both types of division of labor are included in that original. He talks about the pin factory, in which there's many different individuals being given orders and overseen by someone who's managing the entire process.
yeah,
But also, he gives this example of the woolen coat, which is produced, and the labor that is necessary to provide that coat is produced by many different people all around the world who do not know each other directly and are
right,
only related to each other through explicit contracts.
yeah,
So the choice that Coase says is, well, should we organize ourselves through contracts or should we organize ourselves within a firm, has to do with these same questions. How easy is it to write a contract for this particular object, right? If it's very clear, if it's very consistent, if it's very standardized, right?
yeah,
Like a hamburger bun that always looks the exact same and always tastes the exact same, then
yeah,
we could do a contract, right?
yeah,
But if it's a custom order every time, then we do it inside of a firm, right?
yeah.
So this same consistency, completeness trade-off thing exists in this other domain of economics where we're asking, do we organize ourselves under a manager, or is it more efficient if we actually just have an open market in which we're buying and selling products from each other,
Huh.
right? So
Interesting. Yeah,
that's been a huge big debate over the last 150 years because you see the growth of these large corporations,
right,
right? And that seems to be the trend. Well, we're just going from small businesses to just bigger and bigger corporations.
right,
But the newest, most dynamic industry in the early 70s, 80s was software and things like that, which
right.
was the rise up again of the startup firm and the small individual firm and things like that that all interact with each other and you have open source platforms and things like that. So the optimal size of the firm gets much smaller. So these things actually adjust back and forth with each other in different ways.
Well, that's super interesting because a corporation like Apple, which is
Uh-huh.
obviously in some ways massive, they don't make any of they make relatively few things in their products. I mean, Samsung makes a lot of screens, Foxconn puts a lot of things together. Apple designs their own chips, but of course they look out to the Taiwanese to make those
Hmm.
chips, and it's really interesting how even a massive corporation like Apple, um, has where they are on this spectrum. Whereas you can have a really tiny corporation, let's say I don't know, let's say maybe Ferrari or Lamborghini, that, and I might be completely wrong here, but I suspect that these really um, exotic car companies, I mean, they're like building the whole car. They're not going to off the shelf parts, and it's really interesting where the small companies are actually producing in some ways quite a bit more particularity, but of course at an extremely high cost. And these massive corporations, but I guess then you just have to ask yourself, in what ways is Apple massive compared to Ferrari? Because in
Hmm.
some ways they're massive compared to Ferrari, but in other ways, in terms of what they're doing
Hmm.
software and supply chain. That seems to be what they're doing, and marketing.
Yeah, so I mean, like I said, the relevant variables or the relevant costs for whether the companies are going to be bigger or larger are changing all the time.
Yeah,
So the massive database, right? That was not part of the building software in the 80s and 90s, whereas it is in the 2020s, right? So
yeah,
that requires a much larger optimal firm size. But then something like entertainment or Hollywood,
yeah,
right? That the optimal size of the production firm in Hollywood is now much, much smaller, right?
yeah,
The biggest entertainers today are people who have one phone and then they can contract with many different sponsors,
yeah.
right? So the optimal size of the education firm or the what I remember, I forget what it used to be called in Hollywood, the something system. They had some system of that's where you have the same actors and the
The
same
studio
directors
system.
always working the studio system, yeah. So that was a system in which it was harder to write contracts, so you would direct things under one organization,
Right,
right, or
right.
something like that, right?
Yeah,
Whereas now it's people floating all over the
right.
place,
And the
right?
the studios owned the actors. They were limited by contract. They
Yeah,
could only make movies with that studio. The actors didn't
yeah.
make
Oh,
very
yeah,
much money compared to the studios. Now, of course, actors can command fabulous sums,
yeah.
and the production companies are quite a bit smaller because, and even though the cost of, we were, we had all the kids around, and the women wanted to watch a rom-com from the 90s, and they were saying, oh, why don't they make movies like this anymore? Well, there's a whole bunch of movie YouTubers that'll tell you exactly why they don't make movies like this
Hmm.
anymore, because of course it has to sort of do with the systems that created those movies and the displacement of those systems. And now we have very different systems that make movies, even though people just say it's a movie. But
Hmm.
what is it? So no, it's
Yeah,
it's really interesting.
yeah. Okay, so I wanted to transition to a slightly different topic, slightly,
Okay.
but it's related, okay?
Okay.
Which is what I actually basically originally wanted to talk to you about, I think, when I messaged you, is liberalism.
Yes.
The ideas of liberalism, where does that fit into all of this? Okay. In some sense, liberalism is clearly a quintessentially modern political system, right? Many of the prominent um, liberal thinkers are associated with social contract theory. What I was saying
Yeah.
was the dominant political metaphor of modernity. But in many cases, liberalism is about trying to get the best of liberalism or the best of modernity in that it tries to gain as much consistency as it can in terms of rule governance, but also by restraining the degree to which the state can use and enforce those rules, also allows a wide breadth for liberty, right? In the name, same as in the name of liberalism, liberty in a broad number of cases, and therefore many beholders or people to experiment and try different things and develop new rules that are contingent on contracts between companies or contracts between workers and companies or social organizations or clubs or things like that. And those are somehow filling in all of those incomplete parts that the core aspects of the US Constitution cannot do. So that's a way of trying to have both at the same time. So
Hmm.
what I copied here is from when we had the conversation with Klein and Matson on
Hmm.
beholderism. Klein referenced this quote from Smith, which is basically like you might think of Klein's career is dependent on this quote in some way, and then I have now realized that mine is as well, right? So this is something that Smith says in this is in the theory of moral sentiments. Okay, so he says the rules of justice may be compared to the rules of grammar, the rules of the other virtues to the rules which critics lay down for the attainment of what is sublime and elegant in composition. Okay, so he's talking about grammar. Are is your sentence constructed properly? Is there a verb in the right place? Are you using the right ending on the verb? Things like that, right? The one are precise, accurate, and indispensable. The other are loose, vague, and indeterminate, and
Mm.
present us rather with a general idea of the perfection we ought to aim at, than afford us any certain and infallible directions for acquiring it.
Hmm.
A man may learn to write grammatically by rule with the most absolute infallibility, and so, perhaps, he may be taught to act justly. But
Hmm.
there are no rules whose observance will infallibly lead us to the attainment of elegance or sublimity in writing,
Yeah.
though there are some which may help us, in some measure, to correct and ascertain the vague ideas which we might otherwise have entertained of those perfections. So,
Hmm.
with this idea of precision and accuracy of rules, he's clearly like admitting the values of consistency. Rules in general, when you praise that we have rules, you're praising the value of and the cash value in a sense
Yeah.
of consistency. But you
Yeah.
have to admit that those consistent rules can only be applied to the things for which they consistently guide to actual virtue,
Right.
right? So what he's and there's a Klein has another great paper on the different senses of justice in Adam Smith. But what he means by justice here in this passage specifically refers to contract and consent, my property or your property, right? So you can teach a knave, right, what it means to violate another person's life, liberty, or property, right? And you can teach them to agree to those rules, and we can teach any community of people these are the rules and this is what violating the rules means in most
Right.
cases, right?
Right.
But what does it mean to be a good person? We can propose rules. We can propose rules that are more or less vague, right?
Right.
And maybe the more consistent or the clearer those rules, the better. But if we make them too clear, then we leave out all of this other stuff and we lead people down the wrong direction. Legalism, we'd call it,
Yeah.
something like that,
Yeah.
right? So the idea of liberalism is to say, let's get these rules, let's get consistency for the lower things, for person to person direct interaction about something like property. And then with respect to the state, right, the state maybe has an exception to whether or not, the taxation is a violation of one's liberty, right? So if we treated the government as just another person, right, they're clearly violating some of these rules of justice when they decide to tax me or
Hmm.
force me to use my property in this way or that way. But we might admit that sometimes even these rules are incomplete in with respect to the whole, with respect to what is desirable or
Hmm.
good for the whole, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
But clearly, if we say, well, the state gets an exception, we're introducing an inconsistency that can unravel if the state moves in its own direction, right?
Right.
So we want to both say that we have consistent rules for how we interact with one another,
Yeah.
and then there's this thing, the state, they can make exceptions, but we're committed to liberty. We're committed to the idea that generally the state should not use its exception capacity,
Right.
right? And that's much closer to the ideal of liberalism. So it has this core modern characteristic in that the rules of justice, right? So interpersonally, but also trying to restrain the state to those rules of justice is is a quintessentially modern thing, but it leaves many things open to many other interpretations of the world. So you can have a liberal, modern state or society with many different pre-modern religious interpretations. Now, no one of those can then capture the state and take over the whole thing, or else you lose that consistency that we're supposedly going for,
Right.
right? But you can still maintain the whole is the idea. And now
Right.
there are other sorts of liberalisms. So the liberalism of Jeremy Bentham or John Stuart Mill was to say, well, what we can really be precise and accurate about is everyone's happiness. And so we can build a system, or I can understand economics to such a clear degree that I can build a consistent set of rules that everyone has to follow, and this is going to lead to the most wealth and the most happiness for the greatest number of peoples, right? So that's going against what Smith is saying. That's trying to include all of the different senses of goodness that we could possibly
Hmm.
perceive and bringing them into one system, right? Whereas Smith is saying, no, no, no. I'm just saying we can only be consistent about the way that we directly interact with one another. Now, Bentham and Mill are put in the same camp as Adam Smith because, in many ways, the practical, direct suggestions that they had were largely laissez-faire, free market kind of things anyway. So they're put in the same policy camp, but they had very different philosophies of how these things approach, right? Because for Bentham or Mill, as soon as someone proposes a slightly different system, which now says that the government has to control all of this thing, or we ought to give the social planner or the efficient expert economist control over the whole economy, there's nothing in their philosophy which says you can't do that, or nothing in their philosophy which suggests that you can't have a consistent system that's not a market system that organizes all of these different things, right?
Hmm.
So there's different. You have to admit there's different species of liberalism, and the classical liberalism of Adam Smith and David Hume was committed to this idea that you cannot have consistent systems for everything. So that's why we have to restrain the state's behavior to a certain set of things, because
Hmm.
otherwise they're going to be overrating their degree of accuracy for whichever system they
Right.
impose on the world. Yeah. Um,
Well, there's a lot there.
yeah.
There is, there is again, if you look at this divide, um, the C and McGilchrist divide, in some ways, Adam Smith basically says we're going to keep the state managerial, and we're going to, and so then democracy basically steps in and says different different groups based on the consent of the governed and a majority of the governed get to decide in what cases who gets to be master. And but even the master is subject to the fact that the master can get voted out, because that's always the question of democracy and tyranny. Does when
Hmm.
does when does the person who finally gets their turn in charge decide, okay, no more turns, it's me. And
Hmm.
I've been reading a lot in the mid 19th century, and one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is sort of Eastern Europe and the rise of absolutist monarchs. So absolutism sort of, in England dies a fairly early death, and there are these restraints put on the monarchy. France, of course, has the French Revolution, and so, but for a while, it continues to sort of, are we gonna have a constitution? Are we gonna have a parliament? Or are we just gonna let a strong man rule? Which goes better for us? And then,
Hmm.
of course, in Germany, you've got Prussia basically taking over the whole and becoming, um, you have the Kaiser. And then, of course, in Italy, which is a very interesting case, you sort of have Italian history in the 19th century is just fascinating, because you sort of have they sort of want to go for an absolutist monarch, but they've always got the problem of the Pope. And so the Pope becomes the prisoner of the Vatican, and the king sort of has supremacy, but then there is a parliament. And of course, then when Mussolini comes to power, he basically says, screw the whole thing. I'll let the king live, but I'm going to dictate what happens. None of that goes very well. Of course, they flip sides in the middle of the Second World War, and then the Germans invade, and it's a huge mess. But again, at the end of the First World War, you have the collapse of the absolute monarch in Russia, the absolute
Hmm.
monarch in Germany, and the absolute monarch in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But in even those cases, by virtue of a lot of what was happening in the 19th century, a lot of the reason that the absolute monarchs could never actually be absolutists was that there was all this machinery that was fundamentally necessary to manage these massive modernist states that, if you look at the Kaiser or the Czar, um, or to a degree the House, the Habsburgs, they were always dependent on the advisors and the generals, and which of course is in some ways a throwback to a feudal society where you have the king and the nobles. And it's interesting to just see this massive experiment in Europe about all of these ideas, all the different permutations, because on one hand, we can use these words in sort of a theoretical pure form. We talk, to the degree that we're sort of imagining them. And then, of course, you had the United States, which had already made some decisions, in the 18th century that were developing,
Mhm.
and then in the 19th century, and then of course when you have the Paris 1919, the Paris Peace Accords, you have this coming together of Wilson and his 14 points, ready to say, this is what the new world order looks like,
Yeah.
and
Well, I got
Europe being,
Wilson. I got Wilson right here.
yeah,
That's
I
for
thought I saw him there. I
that's
wondered if that was
not
Wilson.
that's almost a joke because I'm not a big Wilson fan, but I'm Armenian, right? And many
Yes.
Armenians are rabid Wilson fans because one of his 14 points was give territories to the former residents of the Ottoman Empire. Armenians get a small sliver accidentally because of Russia and stuff like that. And so in a perfect ideal world, if Wilson got his way, we would have Greater Armenia. But
Well, have
you
you?
know,
It's
yeah, I think
Paris
it was
night.
his fault actually
You
too.
might find Paris 1919 by Margaret, I think
Yeah,
Margaret
I should look at
Millen.
that.
It's a fascinating book in that, and people complain about the book because there's a ton of detail in the book. But how can there not be? Wilson comes with this idea of self-determination, and of
Hmm.
course, the Czar. Germany, to a degree, Germany was a little more limited because they were mostly Germanic language and they were sort of split with the Austro-Hungarians. But Russia and Austria-Hungary, it's like, what do you mean self-determination? And under these massive empires, the peoples, you had this incredible mixture happening in Eastern Europe. You had all of these different ethnic groups all over the place. And then part of what happens with the fall of this absolutist imperial style is that part of what happens then in the 20th century is you have the purification where Germans have
Hmm.
to leave, people who speak German have to leave. And in some ways, the Russian Ukrainian war is a continuation of this because in the Soviet Union, even though you'd say it's far from absolutism, it became absolutist. And again, you had this mixing of the people. And then when you went back to supposedly ethno states, people now have to reorganize again, which of course
Hmm.
leads to the rise of Zionism because there's plenty of people around the world who identify as a thing, like the Kurds. I mean, the Kurds are sort of strewn amongst a bunch of different people, and if I talked to another Armenian who was from Egypt because under the
Hmm.
Ottoman Empire you have people sort of all over the place. And I mean, there's just so many categories with
Yeah.
which to try to process all of this. But again,
I,
liberalism sort of imagines that on one hand, it's determined on the rules because the one rule is the king you cannot have a king because king is forever or king is hereditary. And that goes back to other things. So in America, no king, president, terms, and of course, FDR, um, famously has, gets elected 4 times and then the country decides, no, we're not going to do that anymore.
mhm.
Um, it's just, I mean, there's so
You,
much of this floating around through everything that's sort of causing heat right now.
well, okay, so two quick things. One, which I thought about recently, but I don't know how to dig into, is nationalism, like ethnic nationalism, is in some ways a modern ideology in the sense that we think we can organize the people of this nation consistently around this identity.
That's right.
And to some degree you can, but to some degree, as soon as you actually try to, it explodes. Right?
Exactly.
So if you want to organize by skin color, I suppose you can have a shader and you can say who's darker, who's lighter.
Right.
You could get a consistent output from that system, but one, it's clearly not a good system, right? In that it leads to good outcomes. And second, you're going to run into some awkwardness at some point,
Right.
right?
Because skin color doesn't say much about people. It basically
Yes, yeah.
says at what latitude their descendants lived.
Yeah.
and and even
But the obsession, but the point is that the obsession with skin color as opposed to these as to
yes,
other the content of someone's character
right.
is useful or it's valuable because it can be consistently agreed on,
Right.
right?
Yep,
That
yep,
that 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 since it's the thing which can be measured, we want to build a system in terms of it,
yep, yep, yep.
right? Even if it's a bad system, right? Um, yeah, okay, but and then so the things you were just saying about an absolutist monarch and democracy, I think there's a slight issue there in that. So if you remember the Creedal Incompleteness video, I have rules on one side
Yeah.
and then hierarchy on the other side. But
Right.
then hierarchy is split into dictatorship and a council, right? So council or dictatorship are both what I'm calling hierarchies, in that
Yeah.
there's some body which makes a decision in
Right.
all the cases that we need to make a decision, but we don't exactly know the principles by which, or we don't necessarily trust that they're going to make a good decision. So
Right.
democracy is much more the council. It's kind of in between
Right.
unanimous council
Right.
and dictator, right?
Right.
So I would, democracy and absolute monarch, I would kind of put more on that side. Now, you might think of someone like Thomas Hobbes as someone who, if I'm working in this framework, as a modern, he wants consistency, but
Yeah.
he thinks you can get consistency through the mind and the model of a single monarch, right? To the degree that one person's mind is consistent, then we have a consistent society, right?
Right.
But as soon as you have one mad monarch, you lose the whole system, right? Or as soon as you have one monarch who doesn't know, what kind of apple this, like what kind of pie this house likes as opposed to this house, you have anarchy, right? Or inconsistency. So it explodes like immediately.
Right.
But like the Sun King, right? An absolutist monarch is one way of trying to preserve consistency in a system, in a person, instead of in rules. But those methods of building a modern, consistent political system fade out very quickly or very
Yeah.
obviously,
Yeah.
or those kinds of things are much more agreed to be not the way to go. So we lean on the rules thing, but the rules have that awkwardness or that incompleteness problem that the other systems don't have. But what
Right.
I'm saying about the advantage of liberalism is that it's modern in that it's committed to rules, but it's committed only to rules in the domain of the government and
Right.
when the government is allowed to make these exceptions. In many other places, it says leave the rules loose, vague, and indeterminate, and leave them to the negotiation of other processes of society.
Right.
Right? So the sort of that's basically what Hayek's ideas are, right? In The Road to Serfdom, is he's very worried about, and he uses the word arbitrariness a lot, right? So he's very worried about the fact that there was an idea that um, he writes this in 1944, so he's worried about the prospect of where governments are going to try to go after the war, right?
Hmm.
Whether they see the organization that we get during wartime and want to have that organization persist into non-war activities. And he
Right.
says these are fundamentally different activities. The idea is we can have political freedom, but no economic freedom. So we're just going to vote on how all of the economics organization should be done. And he says a problem like that is necessarily going to lead to arbitrary decision making in many different ways. That so in a sense, Hayek's ideas was that consistency and order can develop through a marketplace, right? And we don't need strict rules and regulations to develop order in a marketplace. It's an endogenous or a spontaneous order from the bottom up.
Self-organizing, as John Vervaeke would say.
Yes, yeah, something like that. Yeah. So the fact that there can be self-organizing systems mean that we don't need to fear if we don't impose rules on absolutely everything,
Right.
right? So we should impose rules on those things which, if they go wrong one time, we lose the whole thing. That is the government and them shooting everyone in the streets, right?
Right.
But we don't want to prematurely put rules on the thing which, when we do, then we end up in more and more awkward situations, or at least seriously contract our capacities in some way,
Right.
right?
That's super
Um,
interesting. And the 20th century is this massive experiment in this, of course, because
mhm,
after Paris 1919, you've got, they very much wanted to restrain Germany. Uh, England and England and France, both who were colonial powers, very much imagined that being at the table with their thumb on the scale, their colonialism was just going to become more and more profitable. And of course, nothing turned out like anyone wanted it to after Versailles. And then you
mhm.
get this, and that so then after the Second World War, you get the complete collapse of all this colonialism. I mean, in Paris 1919, England is just focused on we have to
Mm,
maintain India, we have to maintain Egypt because
mhm,
Egypt is the route to India. We have to maintain Gibraltar. England is thinking about its supply chains. France, has other things in mind. And of course, the Japanese are out there, and the Japanese have their own plans, which then will hatch in the 30s. It's it's interesting to hear what you say about Hayek, and that historical context is, I by no means know a lot about Hayek, but the little that I've, the two or three economics books that I've read, it's interesting. understanding his anxieties in 1944,
Hmm.
given what had happened from 1919 to 1939. You can
Hmm.
understand why he's anxious. And then after the war,
Yeah, because he sees the rise of the Nazis. He's
right?
he's Austrian, right? He's
Yeah.
Austrian. Yeah.
So then you have this after the war, then this anxiety on the part of the United States that Japan and Germany, at least West Germany, very quickly need to become stable and affluent. And then you have, and I don't understand but then you have these changes in economic policy in order to make
Hmm.
sure that Japan and Germany flourish, materially, because basically the way that the West beats the communist bloc is an economic war fundamentally. And that's, and then Reagan finally puts the pedal down and the Russians just can't keep up, and, the wheels come off communism. So it's just super interesting. And that America was in some ways able to maintain its liberalism, but it could only do it by, in some ways, an implicit magisterial consensus about this is the post-war consensus about these are the rules by which we will work. These are how presidents are going to behave. This is the expectations of the people. And of course, now with 2016 on to the present, you have this question of the end of the rules-based. We're now switching towards is Trump an absolutist, but it doesn't seem like he's going to just give the presidency to Don Jr.
Yeah.
That despite all of the concerns of people about Trump and democracy, I haven't heard anybody suggesting he's just going to give the kingdom to Don Jr. So,
Yeah, but
um,
I was going to mention this too a little bit later that I'm much more concerned about that with someone like Vance, just from the meme versions of him that I understand. Um, but
oh,
so
there's going to
we're
be
just
comments on
yeah,
that.
yeah. Well,
He is a
oh,
Catholic after all, and those Catholics, they are monarchists.
I guess. But then the one last thing about liberalism is that so the Tim Keller video that you
Yes,
cite very often, where
yes,
he said I think he's basically wrong in that video, and that he's half right, half wrong, in that he mentions proceduralism. That's
yes,
basically the idea of commitment to rules in government decisions or in
yes,
exceptions to liberty.
yes.
But then he also mentions moral neutrality, right? Moral neutrality, I do not think is essential to liberalism, classical liberalism whatsoever, right? In that the people, we have these rules and procedures and parliaments and congresses and stuff like that. The people who inhabit those, of course, they're motivated by moral, sometimes what you'd call religious principles.
Right.
In the United States, however, what we have is the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause, right? No established church, right? We have a sense that collectively we can identify whether a church is being established in connection with the United States government or not, or if a religious test is being imposed. That's much, much easier to consistently adjudicate in a much more diverse, heterogeneous group of people. But the question of it's almost like just a popular understanding of separation of church and state at the time. If a politician says, I'm going to vote for this because it's the Christian thing to do, people think of that as a merging of church and state,
Right.
right? Perhaps because the most of the churches that people are familiar with are not established or churches in their own right,
Right.
right? They're just globulous
fairly
Protestantism or something
fairly
like that, right?
spontaneous gatherings of
Hmm.
like-minded people.
Yes, yeah. But that established church question becomes much more ambiguous when you have something like public schooling, or when
Right.
you have policies where the state has to directly be approving of one policy or another policy, or one worldview or another worldview,
Right.
right? So the creation versus evolution being taught in schools, that's a much more ambiguous topic, right? About whether or not the state is actually getting involved in establishing an idea or not, right? Or establishing a certain thing or not. Now, if no one disagrees with the religion and they start preaching in schools, then nothing changes, right?
Right.
Nobody's going to complain about it, even if it's a violation of the rules. But anyway, that I think that should be clear because that's almost an assumption, especially on like the modern
Yeah.
online, especially new right, is that liberalism is about moral neutrality. No, I'd say it's about rules. It's about procedures, especially restrictions on the state's ability to violate people's property. But those rules will not survive unless they're morally informed, right?
Right.
But the rules themselves cannot dictate what the morals of the people are, or else you've wrapped them into another system and you've made it awkward again,
Right.
right?
Well, and
Um,
this gets into, much deeper metaphysical questions about, what is the nature of morality? Is, this question of moral realism. Now, someone like Adam Smith, when and where he's embedded, nobody, or I'd say almost nobody, is questioning moral realism at that point in time. Am I right?
well, that's hard to say because his best friend is David Hume, right? Who is
Yeah.
the patron saint of agnostics or something like that. So
Yeah.
they definitely see something on the horizon. Smith's personal religious commitments are very ambiguous.
Really?
But he him. I mean, he would have grown up Scottish Presbyterian,
Yeah.
but he talks a lot about religion. He does not deny God, but he says one may deny the existence of God, and then this is what they might do. So he might be writing in between the lines there.
But
We don't know
a
actually.
big piece of, so when we look at, let's say, the rise of Jordan Peterson in the late teens, my thesis as to why he struck such a chord at that point, because of course, with the rise of Trump, you now have the question, you have the questioning, and basically the denial and the um, Trump is going to Trump is going to dismiss the rules-based order. You're on your own. You got to pay your fair share. All of this. So in some ways, Trump is going to deny the rules-based order. Peterson, sort of at the, as postmodernity begins to recede and people begin to the the failures of postmodernity are increasingly unmasked in that if everything is merely power, where does that leave any of us who don't have all the power? Peterson comes along and basically says, Peterson, Peugeot, there are, and Vervaeke to a degree, but there are patterns. And so I think the Sam Harris project, which said, oh, we can just via reason we can all agree on the reality of morals. And then he has this really stupidly simple sort of utilitarian thing where everybody knows what they want. It's like, no, people don't at all know what they want. And Peterson comes along and basically says we can together we can see, we can get signs and intuitions and stories of a moral order, and then you can place it higher in terms of a logos. And so there is a structure to reality, and this structure, and then of course the early Peugeot Vervaeke conversations. Vervaeke was very much pushing the self-organizing from below. Peugeot was much more
Mhm.
saying, no, no, it's from above. And so where Peugeot and Vervaeke have sort of settled at is they both settled in the middle. And you can see that in the Midwestuary in Chicago, where Vervaeke's talk is all about from above. And I'm watching that thinking, wow, things have really changed since 2018 in terms of John Vervaeke's view of the world. And so the question of the reality of morals and the degree to which you can trust in, maybe not during my lifetime, but in terms of this eschatological view that we human beings have, the degree that we can trust that in some ways um, there is an arc of history and it does bend towards justice, and that there is moral realism, and that even if you're a materialist and you can say that Mao, Hitler, and Stalin got away with it, somehow in the universe there will be order and balance and justice. And so again, um, and I think that really you had modernists, and again, I don't know a lot about Adam Smith, but from the little I do know, he seems to want to say that there is an order in reality, and that order, even though we're doing all kinds of different things, that order will finally assert itself even over idiosyncratic human volition and actions.
He
And
does not, like in the quote that I gave, he does not deny the existence of good writing. He just denies the
yes,
possibility of giving a rule that explains what good writing is,
yes,
right? And but he even says there are rules which will help your good writing, but they will not infallibly help you do so,
right,
right?
right.
Yeah.
And we see this now with, let's say, large language models that can perfectly dial in the grammar. But
Hmm.
when we read what they write, we have a sense of
Something ain't
there's
right. Yeah.
something's missing, something isn't right. Whereas when a human, they can fool us in terms of that, but we don't have confidence that they will be able to outright the masters, because the
Hmm.
masters have this je ne sais quoi that that we can recognize even if we can't account or duplicate, which is fundamentally because so much about modernity and Newtonian mechanics is duplication. I can,
Hmm.
if
Same
I could,
input, same output.
same input, same output,
Yeah.
consistency.
Hmm.
But then domain, because even if I drop it here instead of here, you know, and especially if I drop it here, because it's going to hit my leg. You can't see it on the camera, but you can't see it. And if I drop it here, it's going to hit the floor. So,
Hmm. And this is a classic problem for economics as a modern science. One of the first lessons you learn is that you can't do experiments in economics, right? Or you can't do consistent experiments in economics. Now, you can. There's a whole field called experimental economics where you put people in a lab and you have them play games with each other, and that's great and fine, and they've found many cool things through that. But you cannot find universal economic laws. You
right,
can't run two universes against each other. You can't
right,
run the 19th century United States and British economies and gold trade. You can't run two of those next to each other
right.
and get the same thing out, right? So
Which is in some
that's the
ways, you
difficulty.
come full circle to that completeness.
Hmm.
That the power of modernity was to say, we have consistency and completeness. And this is what C.S. Lewis begins with in Miracles. This is the whole show. Now, of course, there's faith because there's lots of things that they have to admit they can't know, but they say, if I could know, then I would know. And, it's just someone has to come along and say, yeah, but you can't know. And so, in other words, if I could know, I would know. That's basically an article of faith. And your eschatology is just as faith based as my eschatology because we both have plenty that we don't know. I'm just a little bit
Hmm.
more honest about my inability of completeness.
Yeah, and so what you said though on Peterson and Vervaeke and structure, right? In that, yeah, they are saying there's order, there's pattern, there's structure to the universe, but they don't do it with clear rules, right?
Right,
Peterson is not like there's order to the universe E equals MC squared. That's what I mean
right.
by order, right? There might be that equation might represent a genuine, shockingly consistent pattern, and
Yep,
that's why it is a valuable thing to know. But he's saying something where the modernists and the postmodernists are upset at him,
yep,
right?
yep, yep.
Because the modernists are upset that it isn't consistent, and the postmoderns are upset that it isn't complete,
Right,
right?
right.
And so that's basically the last thing that I wanted to say, which is basically if modernity is a commitment to consistency, its perpetual weakness will be its awkwardness or its incompleteness,
Yep,
right?
yep,
So what the postmodern theorists in general are possibly the people who poke at the inconsistent or the incomplete moments of modernity or point out to modernity its own inconsistencies to try to undermine the whole system, right?
yep,
Now, there's
yep,
a healthy version of that. There's the jester version of that. There's the
yep.
trickster monster on the edges version of that. That's like Pajot's favorite character in history, right? Um, But there's also the anarchist version of that that
Yep.
wants to point out the inconsistency or wants to point out the incomplete moment so that they can destroy the whole thing because they think they can reign over the chaos.
Yep.
That's a possibility,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so that's so someone like Foucault, right, point is basically saying modernity has all these systems by which it measures goodness, right? And when it does so, it ends up not identifying the right people in the right way and spitting them out into different categories, right? So on something like homosexuality, many different Christian traditions have condemned homosexuality for a long time. That's not new. But what was new to modernity was putting them in mental institutions, right? And I think that a large point of Foucault's point in his, I haven't really read too deeply into it, I just read some of it in undergrad, is that only with modernity can you say homosexuality is wrong because it's a medical aberration, and
Right.
therefore we can treat it by isolating it, and
Right.
so that we can keep the rest of society consistent and keep these weird people off to the side,
Right.
right?
Right.
And so the marginalized person is post-modernity's piece of evidence that modernity has clearly failed to live up to its own standards in a
Right.
way,
Right.
right? Um, and I don't know much about that. Those are maybe more the left-wing postmodern theorists, whereas the right-wing ones are now what we'd think of as the post-liberals or something like that. And so to the extent that liberalism is a modernist philosophy or a modernist outlook, its commitment and its um, approbation or its putting forward of rules as one of the ways in which we're going to constrain a violent state, right?
Right.
But if then it's committed to those problems, then its weaknesses are the moments in which those rules don't work, the
Right.
Civil War, or all of the various different awkwardnesses. Does the president have the right to impose tariffs unilaterally under this 1971 law or whatever? All of those things like that. That's the weaknesses of liberalism, which we can try to deal with. But if we can't perfectly deal with it, then the post liberals basically say, you made us commit to these rules, and so you've led us into chaos,
Right.
right?
Right.
Because you gave us these rules that you said were going to create stability, but when we hit the emergency situation, we exploded.
Yep.
So the quintessential thinker here is Carl Schmitt, who's becoming much more popular on the right. I don't know if you've heard some about
Yeah,
him or not.
I've
Yeah.
I've I've bumped into so I've been reading a lot of Rene Girard, some
Hmm.
of what how Peter Thiel is interacting with them, and then Peter Thiel bringing up Carl Schmitt, and then there's this
Yes.
piece
Yeah.
in Wired magazine about Peter Thiel and his Antichrist lectures, where he goes into there's another Austrian
Mm.
scholar who is a good friend of Girard, and he basically has done a fair amount of writing on Schmidt. So, but I don't
Huh.
know that much about Carl Schmidt.
Well, so he is the quintessential Nazi legal theorist, basically. So in 31, 32, when I don't know the details of the history, I've just read basically one of Schmidt's books and a few articles around it. He's basically saying, well, the Weimar system, right, or the system of Weimar Germany is proposing this constitution, and this is what we were supposed to commit to, and look at all of this chaos that it's caused. And basically, the idea is that he's actually a follower of Weber in some way, but he's trying to correct Weber. So Weber understood, this is an oversimplification of Weber as well, but a system can be organized under legal rational means by this system is legitimate because it's following the rules, or by charismatic means because everyone has this natural emotional understanding that this person is the leader and is represents us, or we ought to righteously, it is righteous for us to follow him, right? And so Weber puts these as two different systems. Whereas Schmidt basically says, no, the legal rational system is always underneath the charismatic system, right? And he basically says something to the effect that um, in certain situations, the rules, whatever these legal rational rules are going to fail. And he says liberalism is a commitment to will-less norms. So we have norms, we committed to these norms, and they have no will or motivation behind them. So when those norms fail, one of two things is going to happen. We're either going to be thrown into chaos, the enemy is going to spill over the borders, we won't be able to organize effectively against them, or we will make a decision, but it's not going to be according to the rules. It's going to be according to something else, and in all likelihood, a cabal of individuals who have figured out how to manipulate the rules in their favor. When those rules don't have a will behind them, whoever knows how to sneakily understand the exception or reorganize the rules so that we're still technically following the rules, but it's leading us in a direction we didn't understand, these are the people really in charge of the system. So To that extent, Schmidt is right that there's incompleteness in any system of only rules. And that seems to be the system that Germany had adopted for themselves at the time. Um, but where he's disastrously wrong is that his only solution to the system is to empower some dictator to come in and solve the whole problem. And he thinks of this as the most democratic solution. He says, well, this strong man essentially is
Yeah.
going to represent the people, right? And we don't need rules to define who's a good and bad strong man. If we do, then we're in the same problem we were in before, right? So where so Hayek, being from that time period, and being in similar circles and knowing other people in similar circles to Schmidt is basically leaving the German speaking world, coming to the English speaking world where they don't know what's going on over there. And he's
Yeah.
like, well, you got to make sure you don't go down that same pathway, right? You've got to realize the latent understanding, the moral undergirding of all of your institutions so that you don't, when your rules fail, starve for a dictator, right? And so that's what Hayek is basically warning people against. So the rest of Hayek's career after this was trying to understand the bottom-up processes by which we solve those problems without needing a dictator, or the cultural or moral background to every set of rules that we ought to understand so that when those rules formally fail, we can fill in the gaps with the spirit behind the laws, is the idea. So he becomes really enamored with the English common law system, which is able to commit itself to precedent and have consistency, but also adapt to new situations, is the idea. So that's all I have.
That's super interesting. That is
But
super interesting.
that's basically that's the challenge for liberals for the next hopefully more than 5 years
Yeah.
is can who can effectively answer Schmidt's problem, because I think so many liberals have been so adamant on the no arbitrariness
Right.
point, which is true, that we think that it's sufficient to just provide a set of rules. But you do need the rules to be complemented by some other culture, or else Schmidt's critique is valid and you can't stop the mob from demanding a strong man. And
Right.
so that's the thing that needs to be counteracted at the outset.
And as you said in the video that I watched in anticipation of this, culture is this other thing that sort of comes up below and
Hmm.
and begins to mitigate these other sort of pure perspectives on things because cultures are these inherited, very diffuse, too large to really easily summarize or definitively categorize,
Hmm.
but they sort of um, people are they're very organic in that people get accustomed to them and they prefer them. Are they arbitrary or are they,
Hmm.
again, this gets back into, let's say, a Petersonian perspective where this isn't arbitrary. These are sort of evolutionarily proven strategies that afford well-being for people on large scales over periods of time. Brett Weinstein would look at that perspective as well.
Hmm.
So, because that's, you could, of course, the easiest way to dismiss Carl Schmitt is to say, yeah, how did that work out for Germany? Because, I mean,
Yeah.
both the First and the Second World War. Now, there's been a ton of history on yeah, I was reading Christopher Clark's Sleepwalkers, which is all about the coming of the First World War. The rest is history. Did a sort of nice summation of it. It's a lot shorter than Christopher Clark's larger book, but it's the First World War is this catastrophe, for Germany in many ways, and the resentment because of that catastrophe sort of plants the seeds for the rise of this Austrian Adolf to come and gain power and make promises, and then but the Second World War is even a people don't recognize that the armistice from the First World War ended with Germans still on Belgium and French soil. Now,
Hmm.
they agree to an armistice partly because they can see that with more and more Americans coming over, this thing is going to tip against them. So they better stop it. But then the terms that they receive and agree to at Versailles feels like a betrayal. At the end of the Second World War, nobody is under any illusions that Germany didn't lose that war. Everybody
Hmm.
knows it. And so you don't have sort of this seedbed of resentment. We were betrayed by the politicians. Um, and
But then you
resentment,
get you get the awkward potentially what's going on with the Eastern Western alliance with the
right,
Soviet Union,
right,
right? As the war is over, it becomes more and more obvious that the conditions which led to this alliance are not going to be there once we achieve our goal.
right, right,
So
right.
what do the rules that we use for our relationship now actually mean? Who's going to commit to them?
Right. And
Yeah.
France goes into Paris. They live there. But France enters into the Paris Peace Conference. Basically, we want a rules-based order. That's the League of Nations. I mean,
Hmm.
they're even
Hmm.
imagining that, well, maybe all nations will disarm. They'll keep some troops just to keep local order. But we're going to give everybody gets in a rational way. Everybody gets their little piece of land, and
Hmm.
they'll be happy with it. Yeah, like really, they'll be happy with it, and we can sort of put and remember that late 19th century you have all this Darwinianism that is really sort of pumping up ideas around race and evolution, that all of these different races are sort of different species. And so if we keep the elephants over here and the lions over here and the tigers over here, then all of those species will be happy as long as there's a zookeeper that can keep a rules-based multinational one world that can keep, because this gets interesting with Peter Thiel's vision, because I'll have to send you that Wired article. It's a
Yeah.
fascinating article because it gets into Schmidt, because Thiel's vision is the rules-based order is on one hand the this resistor that's keeping the Antichrist from coming. But for Thiel, the Antichrist can also not only be this charismatic leader, but the charismatic leader who, as they always do, promises safety and security through order. We are going to, in the surveillance state, again, there's so many ironies with Thiel in this process.
Yeah.
The surveillance state is there's not going to be any crime. Now, maybe there was no crime in a fascist society because, Mussolini was a thug and so the trains ran on time, which, probably is part of it, but not all of it.
Hmm.
And especially for the Italians, to have the trains run on time is, compared to the Germans, where there you've got the culture difference. You go to Germany, when our estuary group starts in Germany, that's like, they're Germans. We're going to do this right. That's their culture. The Italians, I don't know, do I really feel like making the train go now? My cousin
Hmm.
is coming, and if I just delay the train 5 minutes so that my cousin, they're
Yeah.
Italians. So it's super interesting. It is super
Hmm.
interesting.
And
And
so
yeah,
the point on the UN though that you've been bringing up a lot, in that, well, it is quite obvious that the UN, the ideas behind the various rights enumerated by the UN or various aspects of the UN Charter is not just the median of world beliefs, right?
no,
It's very
not at
clearly
all.
Christian. So
Yes,
a lot of what you'd call post-liberal or postmodern suspicion of modern or of liberalism or modern political philosophies is this idea that they put themselves forward as a consistent, self-contained system, but there's almost always something behind the system, right?
yes,
So I guess in a large part, what I'm trying to do here with modernism and especially with liberalism is to argue for modernism, get you to see what its reason is, why it's useful. I don't know if this makes me meta modern or something. Who knows what it makes me? But but moderns cannot lie about the ideals usually that motivate, or the beholderist position that
right,
motivates the approval of using this system for this situation,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And if someone does actually think that they can build a consistent system for everything, then that's the person that you accuse of the Tower of Babel position. But
yeah.
leave my guy Smith alone, because if you read his actual work, it's fantastic. It's much more it's much more wide and resounding and things like that. So
Well,
um,
on that appeal, perhaps it's the best place to land the plane. Leave my boy Smith alone.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
All right. So The Economics Playground. I'll put the link to that below. There's both a YouTube channel and a Substack. Everything's going to Substack. It's a nice system.
Hmm.
Um, until somebody
Great,
else.
thanks.
Um,
And thanks to you too, because all of this stuff I've been building up has been with your ear in the background, giving me little ideas. So
oh,
I'm always working back and forth with the TLC,
well, I'm happy
even
to
if I
do
don't
that.
talk that often.
I think you do pop up on live streams in various places, whether or not Federici is part of the TLC or not, you know.
Yeah, sure. Well, I was in his living room for, when I lived in California last year, I alternated between the estuary in his home, which I guess is not no longer in his home, and Vendonk. So
Yeah, yeah. So
yeah,
J Jacob Federici isn't about as TLC and about as in as it's so hilarious. But
the TLC is incomplete with respect to Jacob Federici,
that
but that's okay. But that's okay.
that's a perfect way of saying it. So, all right. So, and I think you'll probably, motivate once I release this. I think there's going to be some of the other channels that are you've dropped some things in here that are really gonna
Good,
get people thinking. So
good.
I look forward to that. What's your teaching schedule like? Are you do you get like
Well,
a winter
teaching's almost
break or?
over. Finals are next week, and then I've got a 4 week break, and then back on Monday, Wednesday, Friday mornings,
All
teaching
right.
micro and
So
macro.
so those
So
of you who really want Marcus's ear, you've got a window there. So
yeah.
um he's got the man's got responsibilities and stuff to do. So
Hmm.
all right, Marcus, it's great
Nice.
talking to you.
Yeah. I want to talk to you a little bit after you hit record and
Okay, I'll
record
do
too,
that.
but yeah. Yeah.